Hey, what's going on everyone? It's Arcade. Thank you for clicking on the video. So, before we get started, a couple of days ago, I recorded and uploaded a video about the state of the game, addressing multiple game modes and champion design and currency, but unfortunately, it ended up being a little too long. Okay, it went over 90 minutes, which is not what I was expecting it to be. So I've decided to re-record the whole series as one video for one topic. Okay, so the first one we have here, let's talk about champion design. Alright, so the goal with this is to initiate a healthy conversation about the state of the game that we all love, right? And bring some ideas out if we can to see if we can fix what the community is feeling is going wrong with MCOC at the moment. So the first topic here is champion design, and I honestly feel like I'm a little late to this party because there's been enough videos made about how the champion design team at MCOC is losing the plot, right? People at Kabam, they're designing champions that honestly the player base is just not enjoying. And it starts with a bunch of toxic defenders, then it results in a bunch of overpowered attackers being introduced to counter those defenders, and ultimately the health of the game is depreciating. So first we have here is the fact that this feels like the contest of counters, right? A lot of champions are now being introduced that need specific counters. All right, it used to be that if you had the opposite class available to fight these difficult defenders and these difficult nodes, is that you had an edge. But now a class advantage is not enough, right? You need to have specific champions within that class to counter these champions, and overall I just feel like this is not the direction to go under. Okay, this is not the direction that we need to go down, and these 1v1 counter design, it needs to stop. Okay, now to illustrate my point why this is bad for the game, okay, I'm not going to go into why Serpent and Phoenix suck because I think enough of that has been said, but let's bring it all the way back to 2018. Okay, in 2018 we had a champion called Domino come into the game. This was at that point the most annoying defender that MCOC ever saw. Okay, but I don't want to bitch about why Domino is bad. Just let's see what happened as a result of her existence. Okay, so 2019 we have two new tech champions come out. Both of them are Domino counters. In 2020 only one tech champion, but that tech champion is a Domino counter. In 2021 both Penny and Nimrod, also Domino counters by the way. In 2022 we had Shuri and Omega Sentinel, who again Domino counters. It came up to a point where if these new tech champions didn't counter Domino, they were not good champions. Okay, so every new champion had to have Domino in their kit built in to be able to counter this chick. All right, let's jump to what happened with buffs. All right, somewhere along this time Kabam decided that they want to dust off old champions and give them fresh buffs, making them really good and relevant to the state of the game. What are the tech champions that got buff, you asked? Ultron, Red Skull, and Hulkbuster. Guess what all three of these had in common? They were all Domino counters. Okay, so you kind of see the point that I'm going in. Okay, up until 2022, every tech champion that was getting released or buffed had to be built around this one defender that was so much of an annoyance. All right, this design philosophy kind of stopped in 2023. Why? Because we got a new behemoth. We got Onslaught. And this champion quickly became the toughest defender there is. And clearly, the only next plausible step Kabam could take was to design every new coming tech champion as an Onslaught counter. Okay, I'm not trying to be too cynical in this video because this topic specifically has been covered by so many people, but you see the point that I'm trying to make here is that Jack-O-Lantern, Bastion, Solvark, the Maker, who is literally immune to Neuroshock, by the way, because Onslaught and his damage needed to be specifically countered by the new tech champions to make them relevant. Now, what exactly did this do to the previous champions, you ask? Well, they're all irrelevant now. Okay, if you look at the end game player base today, no one considers Domino a top 5 mutant champion. Okay, her relevance even as a defender has gone down significantly. All right, and every champion that was considered god tier because they countered Domino, their relevance has also increasingly gone down month after month, because every new tech champion now has to be an Onslaught counter. All right, here's the question that I have for Kabam. What do you think this design philosophy while designing champions does to balance in MCOC? And this is not a fresh new topic that we're discussing. Balance has been a point of conversation for years at this point, right? Kabam moved on from basic generic champion designs to complicated champion kits, and these 1v1 counters that started to come up all over the game in different classes, they've disrupted balance significantly. Now, here's a bigger issue, in my opinion, which is how do you now buff older champions? Okay, if any champion today from all the way back to 2015 to 2024 who is considered irrelevant is picked up and dusted off, do all of these champions now have to have a buff with the current meta of 2025 in mind? Okay, and how is it possible to make these champions relevant and buff them in a way that they won't immediately be irrelevant when the next meta defender comes in and they have a completely different kit that needs a completely different set of counters? All of the work that went into buffing and designing and redesigning champions is now down the drain. Okay, and how does Kabam make sure that the new counters are actually champions that players want to play with 2 years from now? All right, this is something that needs to be addressed by Kabam. I think the player base needs to bring more attention to this matter. I think that a lot of noise has been made lately about champion design and how this rabbit hole is extremely toxic, and I think the community needs to keep that up, obviously in a more healthy and friendly way. I don't think attacking devs is the way to do it, but it doesn't change the fact that this conversation needs to be had. Like, these points need to be made time and time again and brought to Kabam's attention. And I know that we're going into Summoner Fest, where a lot of YouTubers and a lot of players, in fact, will come face to face with the devs, and hopefully all of us can bring these points up and have them give us an actual answer as to how they're treating champion design. All right, let's talk about champion kits. There's so many new mechanics that are coming out that unfortunately seem to be doing the exact same thing that existing mechanics have been doing for years. Okay, we saw slow countering unstoppable and evade, and then a bunch of champions with slow immunities come out, so we need another new debuff that essentially does the same thing, but only because it's packaged under a different name does not count as an immunity. So we got Decelerate. Okay, Petrify is reducing regen rates, but then we have Spectre now, which essentially does the same thing. Okay, we had suppression debuffs to control power, but now we also have Enervate, which, guess what, it does? It controls power again. Okay, there is a power drain debuff and mechanic already in the game, and I don't understand why there's something new called Power Dissolve. These seem to be a repetition of the same thing packaged. I mean, this isn't the fucking iPhone launch. Okay, we don't want a new package on the same exact thing year after year, because all it's going to do, unlike the iPhone, is it's going to push away new players from coming into the game. Okay, if you told a new player that they had to understand all of these mechanics and keep an eye on both sides of the screen because mind you, there's also a bunch of buffs that do the same thing but then some, the same thing but not everything. Okay, you already have an auto block counter, you have Undermine, but then you also have True Strike that counters auto block. You also have True Sense and True Accuracy that counter auto block, but they do it in a different way. Then you have Serpent's I don't even know what it is. Is it True Damage? Whatever it does, it counters evade and miss. But then you already had Vigilance that counters miss, and you had True Strike that counters miss. I mean, it is getting to a point where we cannot keep up, okay, with the new stuff that Kabam keeps to want to repackage under a different logo. All right, and for newer players, this is going to be a turn off. Okay, this is going to be a point where they're going to see so much going on the screen that they don't want to spend the 45-50 minutes that they spend on their phones playing a video game, and they're just going to go to scrolling on TikTok or Instagram or whatever it is that the kids are doing. And that is a problem, because if we do not have fresh blood coming into the game, Kabam is going to start targeting the end game players even more, trying to milk them even more. And to do that, they're going to have to double down on mechanics like this, building the same buff and then giving it an immunity. Okay, building a same kind of immunity to a debuff, but then introducing the same debuff repackaged in another kit. And I think it is going to get out of hand really quickly if it hasn't already. We also now have debuffs doing what buffs used to do. Okay, we used to have unblockable counters. We have an unblockable debuff. Oh, sorry, an unblockable buff, right? A lot of champions go unblockable. It's really annoying. But now they can also do the same thing unblockable does if they have a crush debuff on you. They'll just break your block, which is what unblockable means. So why are these two different? Well, because if you have a fear debuff, which a lot of newer champions are getting, you reduce the opponent's chance to be unblockable. But if you have a crush debuff on you, well, they're not unblockable, you just can't block. Do you see where this kind of starts to get ridiculous, Kabam? And I think this needs to be pulled back severely. Okay, champion design needs to be more consistent, and it needs to follow a very strong design philosophy that has consistency at the heart of it. Let's talk about how we can solve a few of these issues. Okay, let's say we have two different types of debuffs. We have debuffs that are definitive, like slow. If you have a slow, you cannot evade and you cannot be unstoppable. It's simple, it works. This definitive debuff can have a counter built in as an immunity. So let's say a champion is immune to slow. That's fine. And so the new debuff that you introduce to counter this needs to, one, be visually different, and two, work in a consistent percentage-based mechanic. So for example, decelerate should always be either a 25% decelerate or a 33% decelerate, and it needs to be something that can be stacked. Not only that, and this is the most important part, by the way, Kabam should give the word that this new debuff mechanic will not and cannot ever be countered with an immunity. Okay, we already have nodes designed within the game that counter debuffs altogether. When you have multiple stacks of debuffs doing the same thing, where one debuff fails and the other doesn't, but then you also have another mechanic in the game that completely neuters debuffs altogether, you kind of build this ladder system which you can keep climbing and keep climbing, but it never gets you anywhere. All right, it's just going to be an infinite loop that goes round and round and round and round and round, and players are going to get sick of it. Okay, so these two, this is a minor distinction, I get it, but it is still a distinction nonetheless. All right, and I think something like this needs to come into the game, and it needs to come in quick. Okay, debuffs that will not ever be countered with an immunity, and definitive debuffs that the players know and can rely on. every single champion should have these debuffs work in a consistent manner. One champion slow cannot be different than another champion slow because there's over 250 champions in the game. Not every player wants to memorize every single kit and what every single kit within that kit does. Okay, let's talk about champion design and how this can be balanced. Okay, Kabam already has the technology to turn off or turn on certain game mechanics within champion kits for certain game modes. And I think this is one of the best things they've developed, and I think it's time they put that to use. All right, Serpent and Dark Phoenix, I think, are really cool champions. They are extremely threatening defenders, and I don't think they're necessarily just overpowered, but I think they are overtuned for specific game modes. Just let's talk about Battlegrounds for a second. Battlegrounds is a game mode that players play on repeat, back to back, over and over again for hours on end, days on end, and months on end. Okay? And you have a tier of defenders. You've seen this with your backend data, Kabam, that certain defenders are meant to be problematic, and certain defenders are also sold to players as major roadblocks that they can have to better make sure that the opponent is stopped dead in their tracks, trying to take you down. Okay, and game modes like Battlegrounds, where this mechanic comes into play time and time again, back to back, every 15 minutes, over days and months on end, these annoying mechanics can actually turn toxic. And that's what's happening with Serpent and Dark Phoenix. Okay, Serpent, like I said, I think is a very good design. It's a very threatening defender. I know a lot of player base says that this feels like a boss fight. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, because what it does is that having such a complicated kit within the champion means Kabam doesn't necessarily have to make overtly ridiculous nodes going into the game. Nodes that always need to be tuned up and down, nodes that add a layer of complication that they didn't necessarily test to see if it can be countered with relative ease. So they can focus all of their threatening design itches when designing champion kits, and nodes can be more simpler. Okay, they can be as simple as just adding health and attack rating to the defender, and their work is done. And all players need to learn is how to counter champions and work with champions, not nodes. Okay, so in that sense, I do think that Serpent, Dark Phoenix, these annoying defenders are relatively good design, but they can be better if they're just turned down a notch or tuned up a bit when the balancing happens for certain game modes. Now, Serpent, let's say he stays exactly as he is throughout the game, except in Battlegrounds, he does not gain the immortality buff. Okay, this is a great mechanic that will just solve the annoyance of having to fight Serpent twice. You're already dealing with him turning your dexterity off. You're already dealing with the insane power gain. You're already trying your best to counter whatever block damage his specials are doing. We don't need to extend that torture for another 5 or 7 seconds, sometimes 14 for SIG 200 Serpents. And we definitely don't need that being done time and time again. Okay, when I'm doing 7 Battleground fights in a row, and all 7 of those fights have a Serpent that I have to deal with, that's what leaves a sour taste in people's mouths. And if too many times has a player died to Serpent because of this, the only thing that they'll do is either stop playing the game temporarily, or in a lot of players' cases, stop playing the game permanently. The same applies with Dark Phoenix. A simple and minor suggestion would be the last Nova Flame that Dark Phoenix applies that cannot be countered in any capacity by any other champion other than the 2 that you designed as Phoenix counters. That's what is leaving a bad taste in people's mouth. So the last Nova Flame, the one where she triggers it when she's at 1% health, let's say that does not trigger in game modes like Battlegrounds and Arenas. It's as simple as that. What this does is it still makes Dark Phoenix an incredibly difficult champion. It still keeps all of the champions that you've released as counters relevant, But this also opens up the pool to counter Dark Phoenix with a bunch of other champions. For example, Quicksilver or Okoye, champions that have multi-hit combos. All of these champions can now punish Dark Phoenix's special attacks, or punish Dark Phoenix after she's dropped a special attack, and because of their multi-hit combos, don't get the Nova Flames on them. Okay, these champions can play perfectly, but when she's at 1% health and you get a Nova Flame on you, that cannot be turned off by the number of hits, that cannot be turned off with anything but either an immunity, which not a lot of champions have, or a direct counter like Nico, then Dark Phoenix becomes toxic. Alright, if these two things can be tuned about these two champions, I bet there's a bunch of other things that can be tuned for other champions. Case in point, Jessica Drew. Alright, Spider-Woman nerf has been a major topic in the community and has been for the past few weeks. Okay, everyone is either extremely annoyed or extremely conflicted in why Kabam had to do what they did in the way they did it. Okay, let's first address the elephant in the room. We know why Jessica Drew was nerfed. It was not because she was too annoying on defense. We have seen multiple too annoying on defense champions that have gone untouched for Kabam to then say that this change is because of defense. What Jessica Drew was doing is she was turning off abilities like Serpent's Immortality, Dark Phoenix's Immortality, Kindred's Immortality at the end. She was countering evade a little too well. Okay, she was turning off champions that are outside of her class matchups as well, right? So they wanted to nerf her on attack, but they had to lie to the community because they knew the kind of backlash they would get if they just said, yeah, she's too good of an attacker, we need to turn it down. All right, so they still took the ensnare out of her kit. But this whole issue would have been solved if they had just left ensnare in her kit as it is, but added a little asterisk and said, ensnare does not trigger in game modes like Battlegrounds and Arenas. Okay, this would have been amazing because now Kabam has an actual threatening defender who turns off your abilities at random. You don't know what ability she's going to turn off. You don't know exactly when she's going to turn them off because this every 15 seconds where this ensnare would apply. No player in their right mind is counting every second of the game to keep track of that unless there's a visual counter in gray going tick, 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 letting you know when the ensnare is going to come on. Right? It's like saying if there was a root mechanic where every 15 seconds you get rooted, but you don't know when every 15 seconds happens, that's what it would be like, right? And that's what it is with her ensnare. So they would have actually disabled ensnare for Battlegrounds, and they would have still had an annoying defender in Alliance War and in any other endgame content that they design. All right, that's been my 2 cents for this little episode. Next up, we're talking episode 2, which is game modes. So please comment what you thought about my video here. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me, if you have any thoughts, and please, please, please drop a thumbs up. I'll catch you in the next one.